So thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. So we have 2:02, so suppose we can get started with this session, this live session of questions and answers on the SFD tools and methods. As you can see, we have a lot of presenters here. These are all part of partner organizations of the SFD Promotion Initiative. And with that, I give the words to Arno, so he can welcome us in the session, and then afterwards I'll go quickly through the agenda.
Welcome everybody, and I better get back to Cecilia. I think we have the things ready, and we have asked to submit SFDs, so it's good we can have a discussion on it now. Welcome.
Yes, as Arne just mentioned, we released last month a global call for SFDs, in which we invite all of you to test the tools and submit your SFD reports in the stage that they are, so we can provide you with feedback. So we are here today as a follow-up of the webinar that we organized in January this year. In January, we were glad to present to you the basics on the SFD graphic generator that had recently become available. And now, after a couple of months of project implementation, we are happy to let you know that we have now the offline versions of the SFD graphic generator and a brand new version of the SFD Manual consisting of volume 1 and 2. That's pretty much what we are going to present. So briefly, we will have an introduction of the SFD Manual by Rebecca, Scott, and Alix from WEDC University. And we will have the colleagues Oscar and Barbara Evans presenting the review procedure. And then my colleague Susanne Bieker will present you how to submit your SFD using the Helpdesk. And then we'll be happy to open the microphone for you, so you can pose any questions you might have regarding the tools and the methods that we'll be presenting. So thank you once again for being all there. And yes, we're looking forward to answer to your questions. So with that, I pass the word to Rebecca and Alix, who will be presenting us the volume 1 and 2 of the SFD Manual. Thank you very much.
My name is Rebecca Scott. I'm a lecturer at WEDC at Lerebours University, and I'm here with Alix Lerebours, who's the researcher working on the projects as well. So I'm going to run you through the SFD manual that Cecilia just referred to. Just talk through the contents of the manual and a little bit about the process of using it. As Cecilia mentioned, the manual includes 2 volumes. If you're able to follow the live link in the top corner, then you can click on that and find your way to the manual. So if you are able to, you can look through the pages of the manual as I talk, but otherwise in the slides, and I actually refer to the pages that I'm talking about. If you've got a printout of the manual in front of you, you may want to turn through it as well. So the 2 volumes are divided fairly clearly into the first volume, which focuses on the process of collecting the data, and I'll explain what data that is shortly. So it tells you what data you are required or expected or guided to collect, how to collect the data, the different sources of data that you might want to get. In particular, what data supports generating the SFD graphic, and then it has little explanations about issues to consider during the data collection process itself. The second part of the volume, of the manual is a glossary and focuses on all of the definitions that we've developed as a team, as the SFD Promotion Initiative, to guide the process. Within that volume there is an example of the master SFD graphic, and then there are definitions around variables and terms, and I'll explain what each of those means. And then there's some final short section of annexes giving you some extra guidance on data collection methods. So if we look at, in particular, the first volume with the data collection process itself, it refers to 3 main levels of report. If you have questions about that after I've spoken, you can raise questions in particular. But we've identified 3 main levels of report that we would guide you towards using. The first is an initial level where perhaps you have limited data, you've only got time or resources or access to collect secondary data from existing reports, documents, and so on. And you want to produce a fairly lightweight, a fairly straightforward SFD graphic and report, and perhaps as an advocacy tool to promote greater discussion around what's happening with sanitation services in your town or city. There's then what we call an intermediate level of report where you've got access to a good amount of data and you can generate a broader understanding of what's happening in terms of services. And then there's a third level which we refer to as a comprehensive level. If you've got extensive data and the means and the resources and time to collect that, and you have good access and engagement of stakeholders, and you can go and do some observations and take measurements in the town or city, and you can do a much more thorough assessment of the services as they're operating. All of the levels include an SFD graph information to explain what is happening in terms of the different sanitation services in the town or city. And that supporting information is all related to what we know and refer to as the enabling environment for sanitation services. I'll touch on that in a second. We've also introduced an additional level of report called the SFD Lite. This isn't actually included in the manual because we've developed it since putting the manual onto the website, but in the final version of the manual we'll include it in there as well. But this is what we're encouraging people to do as a sort of first go at producing an SFD report. There's guidance on minimum data to collect and a short report format. And if you click on the link on the PowerPoint slide, then you can find out details about that as well. So within the manual, we have information to guide you through collecting data on the 3 levels, the first 3 levels referred to, the initial, intermediate and comprehensive level of report, and then the parts that we refer to as the enabling environment for service delivery, which refers, you can see down the left-hand column, aspects to do with policy, the planning of services, equity, and then what we call outputs of service delivery, expansion, future services, and then the service outcomes. And then depending on which level of report you are developing, you can look at the particular subcomponents around those aspects of the enabling environment, and then there's guidance to tell you which elements you are kind of guided to collect depending on the level of report. So for every level, we're recommending people at least write about the policy environment, issues to do with institutional roles and responsibilities and standards of services. But when you come to other aspects, for example, looking at the expansion of services to meet future demand, we're saying that for the initial report and the intermediate report, it's not really necessary to include that information. If you can get it for an intermediate report, then do. But for the full comprehensive report, we expect all of those aspects to be covered to the extent that you can collect the data. So just moving on to one example of a subcomponent. So I mentioned we've got aspects of the enabling environment then, and then each has various subcomponents. So within policy, there's a question to be answered around the institutional roles within this town or city for sanitation services. There's guidance as to where you might be able to collect that data from different sources, primary and secondary data sources. And then again, guidance on which of those sources may be appropriate to investigate for the level of report that you are intending to write. So hopefully if you're thinking which level to go to, you can look at the table with the details, identify the resources, the access to information you're likely to have, and that will help you choose which is the most appropriate level of report to aim for. And if this appears to be too complex, then you may want to start with the SFD Lite report. and then progress on as resources and commitment kind of increases. The bottom section of the enabling environments, we've pushed it to the bottom, but it's perhaps one of the most significant elements to collect, is referred to as service outcomes. And this is looking at the extent to which excreta that is generated from on and off-site sanitation is actually being managed through the service chain, and that the information you collect here is what particularly generates the SFD graphic. So it's a very important one to take account of, which is why all of the levels of report require some extent of data collection around that, with increasing complexity as you go through the levels. And what we have as well is a table that prompts questions for you to ask in relation to either off-site sanitation services, so wastewater going straight to centralised or decentralised sewers, and then a series of prompt questions for you to answer to the extent that you can, to generate the data and generate the narrative around what's happening in terms of services in the town or city. So there's an example of the types of questions you may be trying to address. I don't have time to go into them, so if you've got the report available or you can remember some of these questions and you want to know more what they mean, then do ask afterwards. And also there are examples for if you're looking at on-site sanitation services where excreta is either contained on-site in a pit or a septic tank, or where, as in examples where it's not contained and is discharging straight into some kind of secondary system. And again, there'll be questions that prompt you to collect the data to answer those particular questions. So the types of data to collect are also explained, and this is what we refer to as performance data. So how are services performing through the sanitation service chain in relation to all the different services, and we are asking you to identify the extent to which those services are effective, reliable, achieving any performance standards or targets. And to help you answer that question, we've identified a series of quantitative data sets, and this is just an example. There's a much more detailed, well, there's a longer table in the report to this, covering all the stages of the service chain, and also qualitative information as well to collect. And again, this is an extract of a longer table, and gives guidance onto sorry, the type of data to collect and where you might get that information from. Different stakeholders, different sources of information. And these performance data sets will address and respond to some of the questions in the enabling environment, particularly to do with the service outputs. So what's the quality and quantity of services being delivered, and the narrative, again, around the service outcomes, which generates the SFD graphic. So as you work through the report, it gradually builds up the supporting information to help you collect the right sort of information that you will then use either to generate the SFD graphic or to write the explanation behind that, the narrative, that when people come to ask questions about, well, how did you get the information, or what does this arrow particularly mean, what does this element of the SFD graphic mean, that you've got the narrative to justify the result, and also to explain what's actually happening in the city and where there's a need to give attention to improving those services. The manual also guides you through how to use the graphic generator, and as was mentioned before, that was covered in the webinar that was held back in January. So if you need to understand the specifics of generating an SFD, then you can follow that. But there is a step-by-step guide as well written into the manual and on the website. So the manual content reflects what's now on the website, and you can follow either. And the main steps explained in the manual are to provide some general information, some sort of background information about the city, how you have then to select what sanitation systems you have identified as being within that city, and the information you need to complete what's called the SFD matrix, which again was explained in the earlier webinar. And we can cover as well if you have questions about that. So as you work through the manual, it will prompt you with how to complete the sanitation systems, which you then select on the grid on the website, and to start to complete the information that generates the SFD matrix, to populate the cells in the SFD matrix. And when you create your matrix from the website, it summarizes all of the information into a nice format. All of this information then goes into creating the SFD graphic, and when you press on the button on the website, out comes whatever SFD is resulting from the information that you've put in. So that's probably the more better known part of the manual, is the link to the website and how to produce the graphic. But hopefully this explains that we're also asking you to collect data to explain what's going on behind that graphic, to reflect what's happening in the town or city. So some of the issues we want you to consider when collecting data are ethical considerations, how to manage data, and how to consider stakeholder engagement. We feel that engaging with stakeholders in the city is a really important part of the process if you have that opportunity. If you're trying to just do an SFD light report initially to generate engagement in the first place, then you may not do that, but then ideally you would move towards a process of engaging the key stakeholders. This might involve doing a sort of stakeholder analysis process, and then there are tables in the manual that will guide you into how you may want to analyze and present the information that you've gathered in that consultation process. The manual also gives you guidance on methods for data collection, and there's some simple guidance in good practice around doing literature reviews as a source of secondary data, and then for collecting primary data through key informant interviews, focus group discussions, and observations in the field. There's also a section talking about evaluating the credibility of those data sources, and that's linked to the review process, which will be explained shortly by Oscar. And it's important, I think, for us to point out that we recognise that everybody will face challenges when trying to collect data, and there will be gaps in the data that you collect. So we ask that all of the assumptions that are made when working out for yourself what results to put in the matrix, SFD matrix, for example, or how to explain some of the services. If you've made assumptions, to state those really clearly, so so that everyone can see what's going on behind the report, and there's as much transparency as possible. So we do recognise that. The second volume in the manual is where I mentioned it talks about definitions and terms, and it's all of the details that build up the master SFD graphic. There's a lot of there are a lot of terms and variables included in the process, so we've developed between us, and very much led by Leeds University, built up very comprehensive data sets and descriptions, around all of these variables and terms. So within the manual is a printout, lots of tables showing that all of these different variables, giving them descriptions, short descriptions, and then much more detailed definitions. So if you're not sure what you're looking at or what you need to refer to target where you put your sanitation systems, if you read the definitions, as explained in the right-hand column of all of these tables, then that will hopefully guide you towards which variable you need to be selecting. That covers fecal sludge, wastewater, and supernatant coming from different sanitation systems, and it accounts for these different conditions where the groundwater is considered to be at risk or not at risk. I think I counted up this morning, I think there are 90 variables defined. Barbara Evans may or may not verify that. So hopefully every possible combination you're looking at in your town or city is going to be covered through those definitions of the variables that we've used in the whole process. And similarly, there are lots of terms used to describe different sanitation systems, what's happening in terms of pits and septic tanks and soak pits and types of sewers and types of connections. And again, those terms are all described with quite detailed definitions against them that are referenced where appropriate. This is again just an extract from the table. And again, I counted up about 62 terms are explained in the manual. So there's lots of information in there to guide you through as you're working out what is it I need to refer to in my report. All of this information feeds into a set of schematics. I'll show you in a second, but they give you visual representation of each of the different options that may come up in the cells in the selection grids. So at the end of the manual, there's a whole series of schematics, so they're representing all of these different options. So here's one example. It's a fairly straightforward a latrine emptying into a soak pit directly with no containment actually within the latrine here, but discharging into a soak pit. And the second schematic example I'm showing you, and again there are very many of these in the manual, is a rather more complex system where you've got fecal sludge being contained in a line tank with some extent of that being removed and supernatant discharging through into a sewer network. So again, hopefully for every situation you're uncertain about, you can refer to a schematic, you can refer to the variables and the terms, and you'll find what you're looking for in the manual, and that will help you in the process. So that's the end of the manual. I'm aware that's taken quite a long time. There's quite a lot in there. Just to finally say that we've put on the website, if you haven't seen them already, a series of frequently asked questions. There's a link to the FAQs on the page there. And these are our responses to the sorts of questions that you're likely to ask or have been asked about the SFDs themselves, about the process of making an SFD report. If you're struggling with some of the details in the report, you might refer to an FAQ, or some of the actions or decisions you have to take when you're actually developing the SFD graphic for yourself. So that is a run through the manual. I'm sure there'll be questions, so we'll leave those to the end, but I'm going to hand back to Cecilia now, who will take us on to the next part. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That's a very comprehensive presentation of what we can expect to find inside of the manual. It's the result of a couple of months of work that developed from the preliminary versions and draft versions that we had from the manual. Thank you once again. So now we move on to Oscar from University of Leeds, who introduces the SFD Review Procedure. Oscar.
Hi, thank you, Cecilia, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to do the presentation about the review procedure. So first thing I'm going to say is what's the review procedure. So that's a procedure to ensure transparency of credibility of seed flow diagram reports by evaluating the credibility of the sources used to develop the seed flow diagram. Here you can see the first page of the document that can be downloaded from the web page of the project. And this review procedure is compulsory for publishing seed flow diagrams reports on the web portal. And also it represents the quality mechanism of the seed flow diagram project initiative. So the documents needed for the review process are basically four. First are the seed flow diagram files. Basically that's the seed flow diagram in a JSON file. The second is the sheet flow diagram report. The third one is the completed users checklist. And the last one is the source evaluation tool. I'm going to be focusing on the last two. And just to say that all these documents can be uploaded to the sheet flow diagram helpdesk or can be sent via email to the address that can be seen here on the slide. So the user's checklist is a set of questions on basic aspects of the report. Those questions are like, for example, is your sheet flow diagram the first one produced for the city? And then you need to answer yes or no. Or was the sheet flow diagram methodology used? And you can say yes or no. Or does the report follow the template provided? Yes or no. So they are basically around 15 questions, and you need to answer all these questions in order to finalize the review process. Then the user self-assessment of data sources is the source evaluation tool, which is an Excel-based tool that can be downloaded from the web page as well, and automatically calculates the credibility of the sources as high, medium, or low. And on the tool itself, on the first page, you can see a quick step-by-step guide on how to use the tool inside the tool. So when you open the Excel-based tool, and the first tab shows the step-by-step guide, which is shown here on the slide. And if you need to read that first in order to complete the source evaluation procedure, which is shown on the next tab, which is this tab that appears now on the screen. So in this tab, you can see an start button here. And when you click that button on the tool, then a multi-page window pops up and consists of 4 pages. And each page represents the 4 types of sources that you can use in the report. That is municipal provider records, documented studies, interviews, and also observations. And each of these type of sources consists of 3 or 4 categories, such as representativeness, depth of data, confidence, and documentation. And these categories have a drop-down menu, so the user can select the most appropriate feature of the source. Then when you complete that for each of your sources, then you can click the button here on the tool, and the spreadsheet will be populated with the credibility of the source, which can be low, medium, or high. And you need to repeat that procedure for each of your sources. And the best way to get used to this tool is just to play a little bit around with it. It's very easy to use, and it's very intuitive. And just to finalize my presentation, just to say that this review process is a process to ensure that all sheet flow diagram reports pass a review process in a similar way of papers submitted to a peer-reviewed journal, to ensure that all reports have meet some basic criteria and are of high quality. And that's basically the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And I think I don't know if Barbara wants to add something to the presentation, and if not, maybe I'm going to give my work back to Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Oscar, once again for this presentation, for showing us what consists the review procedure and what we mean by that. And now I would say the floor is open for questions. I had just posted on the chat the link to the SuSanA library entry, where you can find the the second version of the manual, both volumes. Also the review procedure that Oscar was mentioning, as well with the source evaluation tool. So all the material that you need for producing an SFD and following the standard methodology that the SFD PI has developed over the years. I also tagged in this SFD Helpdesk email where you can write us in case you have questions, in case you have troubles completing an SFD graphic or a report, or also in case you want to submit your SFD for review. Beverly?
Oh, okay, good. My name is Beverly, and I am a student, a master's student. I'm currently carrying out some research for my thesis, and I'm using the SFD toolkit to assess sanitation in a small town in Uganda. So I'm doing my research, but I've realized the town I'm in doesn't really have much information. Like if I carry out key informant interviews, they don't have much in terms of records about maybe sanitation coverage. Let's say the latrines, how many are there, or what coverage is there, or how many are sealed, or what types of facilities are emptied. So in making assumptions, I just want maybe to ask for guidelines on how you then make good assumptions when you're filling in the SFD metrics.
Anyone from the SFD PI team willing to give an answer to this question?
Yes, I can speak to this briefly. It's Barbara here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So it's a really great question. Thanks, Beverly. And it doesn't have a simple answer. I think Rebecca and other colleagues would also speak to this. There are two things that we would generally say. The first one is that it's better to make some assumptions and express that, put it all out on the table, and then use that as the basis for a conversation. So one of the things that we find in a lot of cities is if you can just, using your sort of practical, assessment of what's going on and the best possible information that anybody can find, or even people have opinions, and at least articulate what those assumptions are. And then if you're able to bring some of the stakeholders together, it's much easier for people to respond to something that you've put down on paper than to sort of start from a blank sheet. So that's one sheet. I'll try and speak more shortly. And so the first thing is have a go and then try and bring some stakeholders together to talk about the assumptions, because the process is as important as the result in a way. And the second thing that I would say, and I would really kind of be interested to know Rebecca's and other colleagues' views on this, is that you can also look at other examples. So if you don't know what's going on, so for example, if you have a lot of pit latrines and you really aren't sure how much emptying is happening, you could even try and say, well, look, if the amount of emptying is happening in this town is similar to what's happening in another similar town from the database, this is what the ship flow diagram would look like, and you can use that as the basis for a conversation. So what we kind of generally say is you need to try and pull together as many possible sources of information as you can, and just come up with something that you think is the most credible estimate as your starting point. That's what I think we would say.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Beverly, for your question. I can see that Dipti had his hand up. Do you still want to pose your question, Dipti? Exactly. You can either type in your question or we come back to you in a second. Before we go on with the session, with the questions, I would like to invite my colleague Susanne Bieker to present how does it work for the help desk in case you want to submit your SFD.
Okay, so yeah, sorry for not being able to show it live. So this is the starting page you see when you go to sfd.susana.org. And when you now see on the top right, there's this black button, login to Helpdesk. And when you click on this, so we need the next page, you're in the login frame. Anu, could you switch the page, please? Or can I do? Yes. So then you're in the login area where you need to enter your username, your SuSanA username, and your password, and then you can log into the help desk. So when we go to the next slide, I can do it here, right? Then this is the page. This is the inbox you see, and you can see there's a new button. We installed a new button for you to ease to submit SFDs. It's on top in writing, submit an SFD. And when you click there, you enter the we call it the SFD submission area, and you can find all necessary information which Rebecca and Oscar already introduced. You can find them here. So it's a very short introduction of also what Oscar mentioned. So we need 4 parts when you want to submit your SFD. The first is the SFD report. You can see in the middle, to start this process, we need 4 files from your side. First, the SFD report, and then you can find in red also the links to the relevant documents in here. The SFD graphic, so we need the JSON file. It's also explained why we need the JSON file. I will come to this a bit later. Third, the user's checklist, also with a link to the template for this. And fourth, the source evaluation tool, also with the link to the template. When you scroll down a bit, you see at first, step 1, we ask you to enter the city's name and where the city is located. And on the right-hand side, on the bottom, you can see you can choose the level of the SFD, just as Rebecca explained. So it's the same mask you find when you use the graphic generator. And when you scroll further down, you can see there, as is described as step 2, the uploading of the 4 files. And as long you have not uploaded, you can see on the top left, on the bottom right, the submit button is not active. So we request you to upload those 4 files, for the report, the graphic, the user's checklist, and the source evaluation. When you just click on this uploading button, there appears a window, and you can just use take the file from your computer you produced, for example, the SFD report, and upload it. And then you can see there's a green arrow that is already uploaded, and you can see that there's also the name given of the file you uploaded. So I mentioned for the graphic, we request to upload the JSON file. So we request you to use the graphic generator and to upload the JSON file for us, because the JSON file includes the graphic, so the picture, the graph, and also the metrics and the selection grid. So it's easier for us to follow the whole process and the data you used. And as Oscar mentioned, the filled user's checklist and the source evaluation, just upload it like when you filled it, and then you can see this button on button right active. When you just click on there, we receive the SFD for review, and then we can easily start the review process. Yeah, that's the what is really new on the help desk, to make it really easier to have only those 4 files, which are very easy templates by now available, and which you can find all on the same page, all the links to the templates. You can easily upload those and send them for review in order to get in contact and get in exchange on quality requirements. Yes, so far from my side regarding the new things on the SFD help desk.
Thank you very much, Susanne. Yeah, it was a great overview. I just posted here also on the chat the link to the SFD portal in case you didn't have the chance to visit it yet. So you're more than welcome. And also I'm pasting now the link to the global call for SFDs. In case you are working on an SFD, we'll be happy to receive and review it. Okay, do we have another question? Does someone wants to ask something, either on the microphone or on the chat?
Okay, thanks, Sanjana. That's a great question. It comes up a lot. So the question for anybody who can't see the chat is about why septic tanks connected to open drains show as not safely contained. And that's because the treatment process that you get in a septic tank is very, very limited. So generally you get a 1 log reduction in fecal contamination in the effluent from a septic tank compared to the influent. So the liquid fraction that comes out of a septic tank is not safe. It's in particularly if you have high rate of usage for the toilets, you're going to get high level of fecal contamination in the effluent, even if the septic tank is regularly desludged. And for that reason, septic tanks which empty into open drains are not counted as safe, because the effluent is going out into an environment where we know from a whole bunch of research that there is significant risk of humans coming across that hazard. Essentially that creates a hazard in the environment. We could have a very long conversation about this, and indeed we have, and colleagues from CSE have also, we've been debating this for a very long time. My own personal opinion is that it would be much more appropriate for that effluent to be in a soak pit or in a sand drain, entering into the groundwater continuum, where you're going to get fairly rapid decay and treatment. But in an open drain, the risk of direct contamination is extremely high. So we count those septic tanks as not safe. Well, we could argue about it, and we can indeed argue about it. I don't think we could probably resolve that here in this online discussion. It's a very interesting problem, but I mean, just to be very technical about it, you would get lower rates of exposure and more effective die-off if you were to provide a basic sand drain or soakage pit for that effluent rather than direct connection to the open drain.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm also posting here the link to a video which is actually prepared by Sandek Ervag as part of the massive open online courses, in which we can see what it means contained and not contained for the SFD methodology. I think we have more people typing. Sanjana seems to be satisfied with the question. Do we have any other question? Perhaps, Barbara, maybe then I make a question. That was a question that appeared last week while Alix and I were having a workshop in Mali. And the question was, what's the difference? Why do we have septic tanks and also full line tanks in the SFD selection grid? What is actually the difference between the two of them? I mean, I know the answer, I know where to find, but perhaps it's nice to hear from you as well.
Yes, no, that's a really great question, and that one comes up quite a lot. And it has actually two answers. One is to do with what I would refer to as common terminology, that I think many people will use the term septic tank when what they really mean is just a sealed tank. So a real septic tank, just for the sake of everybody listening, is an engineered piece of infrastructure which is designed to have a retention period of a certain amount and designed to encourage settling of a certain fraction of the solids. So just a regular tank won't have the same hydraulic characteristics as a septic tank. And then the second thing about a true septic tank is that the discharging effluent, the liquid effluent, needs to be disposed of in a way which is appropriate according to the hydraulic design, the hydraulic performance of that septic tank. So, I mean, one of the things to say to people on the call is that generally if you ask people whether they have septic tanks, it's really worth interrogating that question a little bit further to find out if people really mean septic tanks or they just mean sealed boxes, which give you a very different type of hydraulic performance and therefore different risk in the effluent that's coming out. But it is a really good question, and just for the sake of everybody listening, there is a real constant debate about this, and one of the really big advantages of having the SFD conversation is to get people to think more seriously about what's happening inside their on-site first order treatment facility, whatever it is. I don't know if that's what you had in mind, Cecilia.
Thank you, Barbara. Yep, it's totally mine. Ashutosh wanted to make
I'd like to know where you can get the data for the census. I'm from India. For the population data or the toilet details, typography, where can you get those things?
Thank you, Ashtosh, for your question. Perhaps then I could invite the colleagues from CSC to reply to this question, Beatrice and Shantanu.
Hello. As Asutosh was asking the question about the population, all these data are available in the Census of India. You can go directly to the census2011.gov.in and you can find the data related to population based on the household basis, population connected or household connected to the septic tanks, pipe sewer systems, pit latrines, and manual scavenging, open defecation as well. So all these data are available in the Census of India 2011 and we can share the link as well.
Okay, thank you, Beatrice. And what about the on-site sanitation systems? How did you figure out for the cities that you worked on, what is the condition of the technologies in place?
Can I add something, Cecilia? Hi, this is Suresh Rohila from CSC, and answering to your question, I would like to mention that the key informant interviews help us identify, the type of challenges of on-site sanitation system. So,
thank you very much.
If there is a shortcoming, yeah, it's the key informant interviews with plumbers, masons, and or somebody who was involved the time when the house was constructed and when the septic tank was made. So we talk to them because it varies from house to house and it can only come through key informant interview.
Thank you very much, Suresh, for a comprehensive answer. We have a question here on the chat. Clarity of on-site sanitation systems in septic tanks when we select fecal sludge discharged to open ground and not transported for treatment. It should be zero transportation and zero treatment as an assumption. However, in field of a report is considered 50 transported and 50 treated. How much is corrected? So we have a question about the assumptions and how we come up with data. Anyone from the SFDPI willing to take this question?
You can, as you know, you can modify this assumption. I would really have to look at the specific context of partner. It's a really good question. I'm really happy that you are sort of considering this because it's a really fundamental aspect. Once you get really into the detail of looking at the SFD, you realize that there's a bunch of important information and performance characteristics that you need. I'm not sure I could totally answer this question just right now off the top of my head, but since you have raised it, I'd be very much, I'm sure between us we'd be very happy to have a look at the partner case. I apologize, I wasn't aware that this was a sort of particular question. And we can see whether you would make your assumption might be more appropriate. It looks quite reasonable what you're proposing. So in general, I would say yes, that seems to me to make sense, but we could just have a look. And you certainly can set those assumptions to be 0% in each case if you wanted to. I think partner is probably, Cecilia is probably on our list for the December review, right? So we could have a quick look at that.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Perhaps then I go back to Barbara once again with a question that I had since the start, that if perhaps you can a word of encouragement to people who want to start an SFD and why you think they should go through a review process from the SFDPI.
No, I would really encourage, so two things. I mean, first of all, I would really encourage everybody to regard the SFD as a process, so that within the community of stakeholders that are important in the town where you're working, the SFD really represents an opportunity to debate some of these tricky questions, because we are often working in a context where really hard data is difficult to find. So to really just get people really thinking about trying to apply common sense to the problem, it's very powerful. Now similarly, I would really say that this year the opportunity of having the SFD initiative team available to provide this kind of ongoing reporting process, review process, is that we can also support you in that process of coming up with what we'd like to think of as the most credible solution. So what's really great about the initiative is that it's a set of people, all of whom have been in the same place that you guys are now in, trying to do this work. So we have between us quite a lot of experience of trying to sort of deal with these tricky questions. So I would really encourage you to make use of the resource as it's available, and very much to see this as a kind of collaborative discussion.
Thank you, Barbara. We had another question here coming from the chat. What should be the assumption on transportation part in case you have storm water drainage and sewer line being used for the common purpose?
I think I can probably answer that one as well. And again, it depends a little bit on two things. One is what happens at the end of the combined sewer, and the second thing is how much rainfall do you think you're dealing with. So if you have a combined sewer which is discharging just into the river or somewhere, then effectively that's 100% transportation discharging, not to treatment. If you have a combined sewer and when it rains, but it's connected to a treatment plant, but when it rains you have what we have in the UK, for example, which is a discharge weir upstream of the treatment plant, you need to make an estimate of the percentage of the time and the percentage of the flow which is bypassing the treatment plant as a consequence of being in a collective sewer. So in the UK, it depends from region to region, but that might be between, well, typically in the region where I work primarily, that would be about 20% we estimate of the flow is bypassing treatment in extreme storm conditions. So you can make an assessment of that. But all of that is predicated on the idea that that is sewage which is being transported in closed combined sewers, so stormwater sewers and wastewater sewers combined in pipes. If that flow is being carried in an open drain, then we count that as uncontained while it's in the open drain. And then again, if in the unusual case, which I know does occur in India but doesn't really occur anywhere else, if those open drains then reach to treatment, you still have to make the same assumption of what proportion of that flow is not going through the treatment plant. If the answer to that question is 100%, that all that flow is going through the treatment plant, and you're in a monsoonal climate, which you are generally in India, then you can make a very crude assumption that for the monsoon period, your treatment plant is not going to be functioning properly because it will be washed out. The biological processes will tend to be washed out. So it depends a little bit on the hydraulic design of the system. And again, we could look at some specific cases and provide some maybe specific feedback.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much for this comprehensive answer as well. Surajit is also typing. Yeah, very informative. We had a question here from Beverly. How long after an SFD is submitted with this global call for SFDs will take to get some feedback? So we will be convening on the 14th of December and having a look at the SFD reports that we received so far. And we'll also take the chance to have a look at the review procedure that we had developed. So the idea is that if we get the SFD report until the end of this week, we still have the chance to include it in the review procedure next week. Otherwise, we'll just conduct the review through the standard SFD Helpdesk, which is how we do it. And it might take about, we'll have Christmas holidays, hopefully earlier next year. I think that's how I can tell you right now. So if you want a quick feedback, then I would really encourage you to send us by the end of the week latest. Otherwise, then we'll just go through the review procedure and provide you with our comments. We have another question coming here from the chat. Hope you all can read. Jay is in the process of making an SFD for a town in India. 90% of the area of the town is connected with sewage system, but in the SFD matrix there is a column W4A which states proportion of wastewater in sewer system which is delivered to a centralized treatment plant. Now that the city does not have a STP established yet, so wastewater is not delivered to a centralized treatment plant, but wastewater through the sewers lines goes to a pumping station as of now, hence emptying and transport proportion should be green in the graphic which is currently red. In the SFD matrix, shall I consider W4A column as proportion of wastewater in sewer system which is transport for treatment disposal, and W5A column as proportion of wastewater received centralized treatment plant which is treated? Anyone from the SFD PI?
I can answer that one as well. Sorry, I don't know if anyone else wants to say something. It shouldn't always be me. And this is something which we've had to deal with a little bit quite often. Well, quite often. So your proposed solution is exactly right. If you show a proportion of the sewerage that's in the sewers going to treatment, but then you show that 0% is treated, but you think that the sewers are in good condition and are certainly transporting the wastewater away from where people are living, then that's the way to do it. So you show, let's say for the moment, 100% delivered to treatment, and then you show 0 treated. You will get the diagram that you probably want with the green arrow showing transport. Just to also say, it's always worth challenging the assumption that sewers are successfully carrying 100% of the sewage to treatment. In my experience, almost anywhere in the world, sewers are usually quite leaky, which is another reason why we have to think quite carefully about worrying so much about wastewater from septic tanks going into groundwater, because wastewater in sewers goes into groundwater quite effectively as well. So it's worth just trying to have a sense of how much wastewater is being collected at the house connections compared to how much wastewater you think is actually being delivered to the pumping station at the end of the sewer pipe. And my instinct tells me that that will often be less than 100%.
Thank you, Barbara. We got a question from Deep Team. Indian cities have very poor data on sewerage network. Making SFD on the basis of assumptions will also affect the long-term plan. How to tackle that? Anyone willing to? Vitush and Shantanu already provide some answer that we should validate your data, but I think it's also related to how much you can do with an SFD, how much data you need, and what's the goal of the approach. Before I start answering, maybe someone else would like to say a word, perhaps Peter?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, before you make a big investment in sewage, you clearly need to make sure you know what you're talking about. Right now, you say you can only make an SFD on the basis of assumptions. If that's all you could do, then you should do that. And as we've been saying, that goes into the dialogue with all the stakeholders in the city. If a decision is then taken, okay, we need really to look at sewage, then you will clearly want to go back and do a bit more data collection on the ground and make perhaps a a higher level SFD, the most detailed one, based on primary data collected from a household survey, which it needn't be very expensive or time consuming to do. And that would give you a greater degree of certainty. Obviously, when you then get into detailed design, that's another level, and that goes far beyond the SFD. But in making that basic decision, what you can do on the basis of assumptions will point you in the right direction. And if it looks as though that's the way you want to go, then you need to take it a level deeper.
Thank you very much, Peter. Dipti, I hope we answer your question. We have 2 more people typing in the chat. Meanwhile, do we have any other question? Any comment? Anyone?
Just to back up Peter's point, I think you know, an SFD process is not
Absolutely.
magic, so it can't solve the problem of no information, and it can't solve the problem of deliberately wrong information. But what we generally say is that the process enables you to get everybody on the same page and sort of acknowledging maybe that some of the information is not correct or is a little bit skewed in certain directions because of incentives or whatever it might be. So if you have a problem with lack of data, I would also say, you know, the SFD is a really good, creates a good forum for pointing out how little data there is. If you can get several stakeholders together, maybe disputing in a positive way, debating what the real situation is, it can really help to shed some light and get some commitment to provide better information, which is something we see happening sometimes.
Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, it complements Peter. Yes, we had a question if the recording of the session will be available. Yes, we will have it. Be happy to share the link with you afterwards. Then we have a question here from Surajit. SFD is currently treated as an entry point tool for policy and advocacy. Can it accommodate solution points as well to make it more comprehensive for doing advocacy with the government? Anyone willing to take up this question?
I can maybe make a comment on that. The SFD is a diagnostic tool. I mean, it is designed to help you see very clearly what the situation is. It does not in and of itself generate solutions at all. What it does is it points in the right direction. It's like, okay, which sort of solutions do we want to look at, and then you know, get down to seeing, okay, what solution might work here. That's a separate process. SFD just tells you where you are, and it gives you a thought about where you might go, but then you just need to match different solutions to that problem and see which one is the most effective.
Thank you, Peter. Perhaps, I don't know if Bitu, Shantanu, or Suraj.
Just wanted to add, in India, what we are doing, apart from showing the current status through the SFD, is that we make a futuristic SFD as well. I mean, though it's not something which, I mean, we tried out and we said that if we would do certain interventions and certain changes in the way the services are given in the city, how the new SFD would look like. And that has helped us to do advocacy in a much better way, and we could actually convey our point much more clearly by showing 2 SFDs. One is the current situation and the other is, say, 10 years down the line, if the interventions are done, what your SFD would look like. And that has helped us to do a better advocacy, I would say.
Thank you, Bitush. So Surajit just added here that government is now more or less aware of the situation, but often they prefer to look for convenient solutions, which is often the case. Do you have any other comments or questions, either on the methods or either on the process, or if you want to share with us the SFD that you are preparing for which city? Another question coming up in the chat. Whether septic tank connected to closed drain can be considered contained. Barbara?
Whether septic tank connected to a closed drain can be considered contained. Yes, absolutely. If it's connected to a sewer that is taking the wastewater to treatment, yes. If it's connected to a sewer, well, if it's connected to a sewer, yes, it can certainly be considered contained, provided it's a functional septic tank. Absolutely.
Thank you, Barbara. And again, it's all about having a look at the system and if it actually functions and works as a septic tank. Thank you. Any other comment, question, experience you want to share? Funny fact about preparing an SFD. Okay. Just want to say before we close the session, then you are welcome to send us comments and feedback and SFD reports and questions anytime via the email sfd-helpdesk@susana.org. Just having it here once again in the chat. The recordings of this session will be available from the SuSanA YouTube channel, and we are very much looking forward to continuing in touch with you and having your questions, answering them, and supporting you on the process. I would like to thank you very much once again, Arno, for setting the techniques for the session. Thank you, Arno. Also the presenters, Rebecca, Oscar, and Susanne. Thank you very much for your time and for being here. And also for Barbara, Peter, Suresh, Arno, everyone who makes this work possible, for being here and helping us to reply to the questions. And of course, a big thank you to all of you who had the time and who could make to the session. And yes, just stay in contact. Let us know where you stand, how you want to develop and to proceed, and we'll be happy to support you. So a big thank you once again from my side, and yes, we're looking forward to staying in contact with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Bye, everybody.
And